Thanks, Tim, Marilyn, and Sue. Good evening, church. Good to see you tonight. Glad you're here. Did you have a good afternoon? Get a little nap? No? Always busy, huh? Something happened to the weather about halfway through the afternoon, didn't it? I went outside and there was leaves and pine straw all over the place. Is that what happened? Somebody turned the air conditioner on? Was that you? Okay. All right. In our reading through the book of Revelation, we come to chapter 12 this evening. Chapter 12 marks a break in the book, literarily, and almost certainly some kind of sequential or chronological break, which could be a clue for us in our attempts to understand how this book is put together. We finished up chapter 11 last time, and the end of chapter 11 really sounds like a climax. In many ways, you could read the first 11 chapters of the book of Revelation and stop and think that you're done. But we're not. You're only about halfway there when we get to the end of chapter 11. But remember, if you've got your Bible open, if you look back in chapter 11 to verse 16 and 17, we're told that God has begun, well, starting really in verse 15, we're told that God has begun His reign. And it seems like the tribulation and everything leading up to God's reign has come to an end. And in fact, in verse 18, it says that it's time for judgment and reward. Judgment to those who have rebelled against God, and reward for God's people. And then the temple is open in verse 19, and we see the Ark of the Covenant, and there is a great earthquake at the end of the chapter. And it all looks like we're ready for the end at this point. And then when we get to chapter 12, if you look at verse 1, it says, "And then a great sign appeared in either the heaven or the sky." Uranos does both. Means both, and our translators have to decide which one that they're going to put there. A woman dressed in the sun, the moon underneath her feet, and on her head a crown, a Stephanos crown, not a diadem, a crown of 12 stars. So as we go through this chapter, it's clear that things that we've changed. And in fact, it begins to talk about the birth of Jesus. And so it seems as if in the visions that John is being given here, that at the end of chapter 11, he comes right to the precipice of the end of this age, and it looks like we're just about ready to read about the new heavens and the new earth, and suddenly we're pulled all the way back thousands of years to Jesus being born. Now, no matter how you read the book of Revelation, it's almost impossible, I would say impossible, to see this as a recapitulation. I'm not even sure how you would not see this as a recapitulation. Just so obvious that there's a falling back to an earlier time here, a flashback, if you will, in the sequence of events. Now, that being the case, that may be a clue to how the rest of the book is put together. It may be that there are also flashbacks or recapitulations in the rest of the book. For instance, it could be that the 7 seals tell the story from one perspective, bring it to a certain point, and then the 7 trumpets start the story over again from a different perspective and bring it pretty much to the same point, which is where we are at the end of chapter 11. The evidence for that would be that at the end of the seals, you may not remember now, but if you go back and read through the book of Revelation again, where we've already trod, so to speak, at the end of the seals, the sky is rolled up like a scroll. The sun turns black. The stars fall from the sky. It really sounds like we've come to the very end there also. That the catastrophic things that happen at the end of the seals indicate that the story is over for this age, and we're ready for the new heavens and the new earth. But then suddenly the trumpets come in, and we're back on earth again. We're back in the tribulation again, but we're looking at different events, different kinds of events, a different perspective. It seems to be a more compressed perspective, like it's closer to the end when the trumpets start than when the seals started. So the same thing is going to happen in chapter 13. We're going to be introduced to the beast, the Antichrist, and we're going to get a different perspective on things that happen during the tribulation. What kind of person will this Antichrist be? What kind of activities will he engage in? If we were here, what could we expect to see? People who are here, what will they go through? And then the story will unfold all the way to chapter 19 where Jesus appears, and then once again we come to the very end, and then finally we move forward into chapters 20, 21, and 22 where we read about the judgment and the new heavens and the new earth. So this is a possibility. Now remember what I've said, that any interpretation of the book of Revelation needs to be held onto with great humility, because there are different ways of looking at this. But I want to recommend tonight that you think about the sequence of the book of Revelation this way. That the seals tell the story up to very close to the end from one perspective. Then the trumpets retell the story from a different perspective right up very close to the end. And then we have this interlude in chapter 12, and we go back and we go through the whole story again. And this time we have the 7 bowls, and we come to the end once more with greater detail this time about the fall of Babylon and so forth. And then finally, Jesus shows up in chapter 19 on the white horse, and we have the final battle where he is victorious. And then in chapter 20, we read about the millennium. We'll have to talk about that when we get there. And then the final judgment in the new heavens and the new earth. So what I'm saying is that the book of Revelation may include basically 3 versions of stories about the end, and we have to somehow try to put them all together to get the whole story. And a lot of people have tried that. The details are difficult to fit together. There's too much space and too many general statements to make it possible. But I'll throw that out at you tonight in your reading. If you're really seriously reading the book of Revelation and struggling to understand it, that might give you a way to move forward. So let's look at chapter 12 tonight. Here's a flashback. We've gone all the way back. I want you to think about this question tonight as we look at chapter 12. Why is this chapter here? And what is it telling us? Because so far the book has been focused pretty much on the end of the age, the tribulation, the events that are going to happen just before Jesus comes back. We did have the 7 letters earlier in the book, but even those instruct the church, as all letters do in the New Testament. Even those letters instruct anyone in the church at any time, potentially, because they are authoritative, just like the book of Galatians or Ephesians or any other book that's a letter in the New Testament. So here's the questions I want you to think about. Why is chapter 12 here? Why are we doing this flashback? What does it add to what we need to know about the end time? All right, chapter 12, verse 1 again. And a great sign appeared in the heaven or in the sky, a woman dressed in the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a Stephanos, a crown, but not a political crown. Okay, political crowns are diadems in the book of Revelation. She has a Stephanos on her head of 12 stars. And verse 2, she is carrying a baby, and she cries out in birth pains and is tormented, literally. Your English translation may have toned this word down just a little bit, but it says that she is tormented to give birth. And there appeared in verse 3 another sign in the heaven or the sky, and look, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7, now we have diadems this time, not Stephanoi. These are the crowns that are political in nature. They speak of political power. All right, let's just stop there, these first 3 verses. These are obviously symbols of realities in the history of God's work to save His people. Let's think about the woman. She is presented to us first. What or who does this woman represent? Okay, I got Mary and Israel. Those are good answers. And why would we think Mary? Because she's carrying a baby, and you already know that the baby is going to be Jesus. So it would make sense for her to be Mary. But we also got Israel. Why would we say Israel instead of Mary? Okay, that's a good answer. The 12 stars probably are meant to make us think about what? The 12 tribes of Israel. It could still, even with those 12 stars, it could potentially be Mary. It could just be telling us that she is somebody who comes from Israel. Is there any other reason that we might lean more towards Israel? Kathleen? Very good. Very good. Yeah. Some of you may have thought about that too, the stars and the sun and the moon. Remember the stories of the visions the dreams that Joseph had. The details aren't exactly the same, but they're close enough to make us think about that. All right, and we know the baby is Jesus. And that's going to become clearer as we go along. Who's the dragon? Be confident, it's Satan. And we're going to know that pretty clearly here in a moment. In fact, as we read the chapter, the identity of the boy and of Satan are just clear. The visions make those clear. The visions never come right out and clearly say who the woman is, but we can be pretty confident in our ability to interpret that given the other symbols that are around this. Why would it say, do you think, that she is tormented to give birth? Why such a strong term there? Because it really is a strong word. We've already got a word for pain, birth pain, and I'm assuming that all mothers in here would assure me that that word is enough. No? Jennifer? Okay, that's a good answer, Jennifer. If this woman is Israel, then the torment that she's going through is not just related to her individual birth pains. It's related to the whole history of God using Israel to bring the Messiah into the world. Because Satan has known that Israel was God's chosen people for a long, long time, and he has attacked them for many, many generations before Jesus was born, trying to subvert God's plan of bringing the Messiah into the world. Because the Messiah coming into the world is going to lead to what for him? His defeat, and he knows that. And so he has a reason to stop this boy from being born. All right, where are we? Verse 4. Now we're going to learn a little bit more about the dragon here, and we'll find out without any doubt that we're right, that he's Satan. In verse 4, it says that with his tail he pulled away or swept away a third of the stars of the heaven or of the sky and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, the one about to give birth, so that when her son was born, he might devour it. All right? Mixture of symbols and reality here. When it says that he pulled down the stars with his tail, what's happening there? Does Satan have a tail? You're scared to answer that one, aren't you? Okay, Chris says that this is symbolic for when Satan convinced a third of the angels to rebel against God, basically, and caused. What's that? Tail represents the followers. That's good. Yeah. Somebody else said something over here. Don't want to admit it. So this is symbolic of something that we learned from Old Testament prophecy, that there was a battle in heaven that we don't know a lot about between Satan and God, and that a third of the angels lined up with Satan, and they were cast down to earth because of that. And those angels now we call what? Demons. Satan and his demons and their actions in the world, trying to subvert all that God is doing to bring salvation to his people. So, verse 5, it says that the Son, and it's kind of hard to put this in English, but there's a word for son and there's a word for male, both together. Literally it says, and she gave birth to a son, a male, which sounds redundant. And some of our translations try to put a male child or boy child or something in there to compensate for that, who is about to literally shepherd, but to shepherd is an accepted symbol in the Old Testament for ruling. And so some of our translations in English just go ahead and put rule. And that's fine because that is the idea. But there is that picture of shepherding that is clearly there. Notice all the nations with a rod of iron. All the nations with a rod of iron. And her child, her son, was snatched up to God and to his throne. Now, that was quick. Verse 5 is pretty much the birth, the life, the death, the burial, the resurrection, the ascension of Jesus. Boom, right there in that one little verse. So this is teaching us something about reading biblical prophecy. The prophets who are speaking for God, and so really we're looking into the mind of God when we analyze the way the prophets speak. And that's the way we should think about it. We're thinking about the thoughts of God, the communication of God, how God sees things, and how he wants to teach us to see things. And God in prophecy is able to see things in very compressed form. He likes sometimes to really summarize things that otherwise in history would cover large periods of time. Not even just one lifetime, as in this case, but sometimes generations. So as we're reading prophecy in the Old Testament, or the New Testament for that matter, but as we're reading prophecy in the Bible and we're trying to understand what it's telling us, one of the things that we have to factor in is that God tends to summarize large periods of time into very, very short statements. And it may not sound that way to us when we first read it. We may be thinking with our Western chronological way of approaching life that he's giving us little chunks of time that are equal, but they're not. Sometimes one sentence in prophecy can be 1,000 years, and then the next paragraph or chapter can be a week. So God will go very fast and slow in prophecy, and we have to get into that way of thinking if we're going to understand prophecy. Remember the two things that I taught you this morning about prophecy. What were they? Okay, she said that they can represent things in the Old Testament and the New Testament. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's wrong. That's not exactly the way that I put it. Right. That prophecies often in the Bible have both short-term, which typically are Old Testament, and long-term, which typically are New Testament, so your statement would fit. But it's more accurate to say that they have short-term, sometimes short-term, and long-term fulfillments. I mentioned the Antichrist to you as an example. There were Antichrists, according to John, in operation in the first century. But there's one Antichrist, which we're going to read about in chapter 13, who will outdo all the rest. So we have short-term and long-term interpretation. Just let me ask you, out of curiosity, can anybody else give me an example of a short-term and a long-term prophecy in the Bible? The two witnesses? It could be. Yeah, it could be that they are pictured in Zechariah, and if they are, that would be an example of a short term and a long term. The two witnesses also, Kevin, bring up something called typology, which is another aspect of prophecy that we need to be aware of to understand it. Typology is really very simple. It just says that God uses certain patterns of events over and over again. Two applications may not be exactly the same, but they happen over and over again. Can you give me an example of something that God does, who he tends to do, that may happen generation after generation? We go for our patterns to the premier event of salvation for us as New Testament Christians, which is what? Well, the Lord's Supper pictures it, thank you, but the death, burial, and resurrection, that is the defining moment for us, for understanding the Bible, for understanding God, and for understanding the way God works in our life. For the Old Testament saint, the defining moment was what? It was the Exodus. They constantly went back to God bringing their children of Israel, the Hebrews, out of Egypt. Now, those two events have a lot in common, don't they? They're both events where God sent somebody to set his people free. They're both events where the people who have been set free can no longer go back into their former lifetime. They're both events where the people, once they have been set free, they're given a revelation about God, the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, the New Testament in the New Testament, and they're expected to, under the power of God's Spirit and presence, to conform to that new life that he has given them, and on and on and on it goes. So this is an example of a pattern that God uses and helps us to understand who God is, to understand his word, and to understand what he's doing in our life. Because if we don't understand who God is, then we'll be confused about what he's doing in our life, and we'll get frustrated. And we may give up on following him because he doesn't make sense to us, if you will. For instance, if we think that God will not allow his children to suffer, and we suffer, then we may get confused and think, there's something wrong with this Christianity thing, I'm going to go try something else. But in the pattern of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we have very clearly a statement that God does allow his people to suffer. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter said, Jesus has left you a footsteps to walk in. And he goes on to talk about how he suffered. That suffering somehow is a part of our experience. We don't want it to be. I don't want it to be. But when God chooses to visit suffering upon us, we have a way of making sense of that. We have a way of understanding that something good comes out of it, that it's part of our redemption in some manner. So these are ideas of the patterns of God working. Let me give you another example of a short term and a long term. And this is one that shows up possibly 3 times. It's the abomination that causes desolation. Anybody recognize that one? The abomination that causes desolation. Jesus talks about in Matthew 24, we'll see it when we get there on Sunday morning, but it's something that happened originally in Daniel's day when Antiochus Epiphanes IV was in charge of Israel, and he desecrated the temple. He put up an idol in the temple in Jerusalem and sacrificed pigs. And none of that was right at all. It was an outrage to anyone who knew the Old Testament. It was a desecration that caused, or abomination to the Lord. And Jesus says that that's going to happen again. Now, going back to our discussion about whether or not the temple will actually be rebuilt, this is a fact of prophecy that weighs in on the idea that the temple will be rebuilt. Because Jesus says that once again that abomination has to be set up, and for that to happen, it would seem as if the temple needed to be there. All right, let me stop. So I said there are short-term and long-term uh, uh, applications to prophecy this morning. What was the other thing that I said this morning? As Christians, we look at the Bible as Christocentric, Christ-centered. That a lot of prophecies in the Old Testament, like the one we looked at this morning for the stone the builders rejected, has become the cornerstone. The Lord has done this, and it is marvelous in our eyes. To us, that's Jesus. But in the Old Testament, it was Israel. So that was a short-term interpretation or application, and then the long-term application is Jesus, and it's Christocentric. Jesus becomes the long-term or ultimate application of many of the prophecies in the Bible. Now, I hope that you can tell just from this short discussion, and I'll stop talking about this stuff because it gets complicated. Biblical prophecy is a complex tapestry that is fascinating to study. It is far more than simple predictions about things that will happen in the future. Now remember, I mentioned this morning, it is sometimes simply that. Sometimes prophecy just predicts an event is going to happen, like Jesus being born in Bethlehem, the Messiah being born in Bethlehem. But many times prophecy is typological. It has multiple applications. It has a Christological application and so forth. So prophecy is a fascinating study. Look at this verse 5 again here. Why is God presenting the life of Jesus to us in these terms here in verse 5? Given all of the different ways that God could explain or describe the life of Jesus to us, he gives us this short little summary in verse 5. What does this summary tell us about what God is trying to say here about Jesus? Okay, she's saying that there's a focus on the second coming, and that would fit the book of Revelation, absolutely. Very good. What else? Well, there's a lot more that we were told about, and he's left that out. Which is to what? To rule the world, to rule all the nations. Now, that's really kind of new information, isn't it? Where in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are we told that Jesus was born to rule all the nations? With an iron rod, by the way, yes. That's not an emphasis in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, is it? The emphasis there is salvation, and so a lot of time is spent on Jesus' earthly ministry. Not much time is spent on Jesus' earthly ministry here. In fact, of all the things that God could have mentioned about Jesus on earth, what one did he mention? Let's stop. Let me ask that question another way. If you were going to say one thing about Jesus' earthly ministry, and only one thing, you couldn't mention anything else, what one thing would you mention? That's very good. I expected you to be divided between the cross and the empty tomb. That's a real hard decision to make. Why might it be better to mention the resurrection if we can only mention one? Because the resurrection assumes the cross. But if we only mention the cross, then we may lose the resurrection, although at this late date, to even be mentioning the cross 2,000 years later says something about that there was something special about it, or we wouldn't still be talking about it. So which one does God choose? That's the ascension. Okay, we don't study ascension as much, but we need to be aware of that is a separate activity in the earthly ministry of Jesus. There's his birth, his life and ministry, his teaching, his miracles, his death. His burial is always added in, it seems like, by Paul especially. Why would he make such a point of adding that burial in? It emphasizes his... Okay. And burned up. Yeah, if it was a whole burnt offering, then his body would have been consumed in the flames. But this tells us that there was a body left over to be put into the tomb. So we have the death, the burial, the resurrection, and we have the ascension of Jesus. And by the way, this is a great way to pray. Many of you have heard me do this in my pastoral prayers on Sunday morning. Occasionally, I love to just pray through the life of Jesus. Start with his birth, and talk about his life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, his ascension, what comes after his ascension. There really is, these two go together, but I see it as a separate event, or at least a related event. I call it the exaltation, because he ascended and he was exalted to the right hand of God in power. That's where John sees him in Revelation chapter 5. And in addition to that is his present ministry. He's not retired. He's not on vacation. There's a present ministry of Jesus. We only know one thing about it. There may be a lot more to it that we're not told, but the one thing that we're told about his present ministry is that he is what? He is interceding for us. And I like that present ministry. And there's the parousia, which is the term from the New Testament for what? The term literally means appearing. And so for Jesus to appear now, we call that the second coming. And then there is a victory involved with that second coming. And then I believe, and I'll tell you why when we get to chapter 20, that there is a millennial reign on earth, a 1,000-year reign of Jesus over all the nations, and that there is a rebellion at the end of that 1,000 years when Satan is loosed. But that rebellion is put down handily by the Lord Jesus Christ without any trouble at all. Then we get, so that's the ultimate victory, then we get Judgment Day, where there's all the books are opened, and the book is opened. There's books, and there's a book. You know, we've all got a book, but we don't want our book to be open on Judgment Day. I don't want my book to be open on Judgment Day. I want to make sure my name is in the book, the one book, the Lamb's book of life, so that my book doesn't matter. But for those who don't have their name in the Lamb's book of life, they've got a book that they've written, and that book will be opened and read, and they'll be judged by that book. I don't want to be judged by my book. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be judged by my book. I want my name in the Lamb's book. Then we have the new heaven and the new earth. So that is the sequence of events in the book of Revelation. Would everybody agree with me on that? No. I've taught you that there are a lot of different ideas. But that's the view of the book of Revelation that I want to convince you of as we read the second half of the book of Revelation. So God doesn't choose any of those things, though, really. He chooses in verse 5, well, he chooses one of them. He chooses what two main events in verse 5? His birth. His birth and his ascension. Now, why would he choose his birth and his ascension, do you think? Right away, it looks like a practical issue with his birth and ascension. It seems like he's doing what? He's choosing the beginning and the end. And so maybe he's just expecting us to fill in the middle. Okay, and that's why I say maybe he's expecting us to fill in the middle. But at the very least, since I'm out of time, at the very least, let me say this. Ticto. Ticto means I give birth. I will never give birth. So I should say, tick 10, she gives birth, right? That word occurs 5, 6, 7 times. I don't remember now. It's at least 5 times in this chapter here. There's something about the birth of Jesus that is emphasized in Revelation chapter 12. With all of the summarizing of the life of Jesus, the birth is left intact, and not only left intact, but is emphasized. Why would God, given all of the things that he could choose and emphasize from the life of Jesus, aside from the fact that it's the beginning and the end with the ruling all the nations, is there another theological reason that God would choose to emphasize the birth of Jesus? Because it was miraculous, because she was a virgin, because it really happened. Those are all good things. It emphasizes his humanness, which leads us, we're getting closer to what I'm thinking of. Okay, that's very good, Jamie. Jamie's pointing out here that we have a fulfilled prophecy because Jesus is being born from Israel. Just like we were told that he would be a son of David, a son of Abraham, and this would emphasize that. Is there anything else theologically do you think this is emphasizing? The birth of Jesus theologically emphasizes what? Okay, very good. I hadn't thought about that. I'll have to go work on that one. Second Adam, very good. Yeah, I've got some good theologians out there. Jordan? His ministry started 30 years later, really, technically, when he was baptized by John and went out into the wilderness. I believe what we should aspire to be, he is our pattern, absolutely. He's the foundation that we're building our lives upon. Consider the possibility that God chose to emphasize Jesus' birth because when Jesus was born, something happened in all the cosmos that had never happened before and will never happen again as far as we know. That God the Son divested himself of all of his benefits, privileges, and glory in heaven and stepped down from the throne onto earth and became a man. He humbled himself and became a man. And we're told that our attitude should be like that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became dead. He died even to dying on a cross. And for that reason, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name above every name, that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow and every tongue confess. Now, so that's the story of the New Testament. The incarnation, which is what the theologians call it, the Word became flesh, is a vital and important part of our faith. Some people ask, Christians ask even sometimes, is it really that important to believe in the virgin birth? And the answer is what? Absolutely. And here in the book of Revelation, that birth is being emphasized. Of all the elements in Jesus' life, as important as they are, the birth is a paradigm shift in the cosmos because of what happened on that night in Bethlehem. So it is right that we should celebrate it and think about it at least once a year. Well, we could go on, and we will, next time. But right now, let's shift gears. Guys who are going to serve, let's come to the table tonight as we think about the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Let's consider the birth the incarnation, the stepping down and divesting himself of his glory that enabled Jesus' death and resurrection to mean so much to us.